Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us today at Japan House London. Today's event, A Master of Human Experience, Toko Mizoguchi Kenji by Alexander Jacoby, is looking at the work of Mizoguchi Kenji, one of Japan's most acclaimed directors in the 20th century and focus of Japan House London's upcoming film season. Alexander Jacoby, film critic, lecturer of Japanese cinema at Oxford Brookes University, and our speaker for tonight, has curated for the season a selection of 5 films illustrating the finest achievements of Mizoguchi's latest years. In today's event, Jacoby expands on Mizoguchi's work on the 1950s through the recurring topics which are also highlighted throughout the season, such as Mizoguchi's depictions of the expected role and exploitations of Japanese women, and his engagement with Japan's literary heritage. Today, in addition to our in-person audience here at Japan House London, we are also broadcasting to a virtual audience on Zoom, YouTube, Facebook, X, and LinkedIn. So a warm welcome also to everyone watching us online. This event is also being recorded, and a recording will be archived on our social media platforms following the event. Now let me just introduce our speaker. Alexander Jacoby lectures on Japanese cinema at Oxford Brookes University and is the author of A Critical Handbook of Japanese Film Directors and of a forthcoming monograph on Koreeda Hirokazu. He has curated retrospectives of Japanese film at BFI South Bank, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, Il Cinema Ritrovato in Bologna, and the Giornata del Cinema Muto in Pordenone, Italy. And without further ado, let me pass over to Alexander Jacoby to start. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and it's a great pleasure to be here at Japan House to introduce my very favorite Japanese film director, indeed, the artist who made me fall in love with Japanese cinema. So I hope that many of you will come back between February and June to experience some of his great films on this screen. So let me start with some high praise. Mizoguchi, says James Quant, is cinema's Shakespeare, it's Bach and Beethoven, it's Rembrandt, Titian, and Picasso. And Eric Romer compares Mizoguchi's film with Homer, with the Odyssey, with the stories of the knights of the Round Table. And such comparisons have echoed down the years. Romer was saying that in the 1950s. Robin Wood also compares Mizoguchi to Shakespeare in the 1970s. James Quant was saying that at the time Mizoguchi's centenary in 1998. And well, I suppose in the 1950s, those kind of links with canonical Western artists were made naturally enough by European writers on film because at that time audiences in the West knew almost nothing about Japanese cinema, and so they reached for comparisons with what they knew. But they continue to be made because a select band of cinephiles recognized and continue to recognize in Mizoguchi a supreme stylistic facility married to an encompassing and humane dramatic imagination. Now, for Mizoguchi himself, this international adulation came at the end of his life, and it was an opportunity to be seized. And I like these images in the first place because it gives you a very rare chance to see Mizoguchi in color. Of course, dying in 1956, color photography was still, relatively rare. He himself only made 2 films in color. I also like the image on the right because it reminds us that Mizoguchi was not only a great director, but also a great collaborator. And his major films depend in part on the work of Yoda Yoshikata, one of Japanese cinema's most intelligent screenwriters. And many of them feature outstandingly sensitive and nuanced performances from one of, I would say, not just Japan, but the world's greatest actresses, Tanaka Kinuyo, and there they all are together in Paris. And I suppose it's also worth, as we look at that image, reflecting this was quite a rare opportunity for Mizoguchi at the time to travel in Europe, because in the early post-war years, it was virtually impossible for Japanese to travel abroad. But Mizoguchi traveled abroad because his films were beginning to be hailed abroad. Here he is again on the right, again with Tanaka Kinuyo in Venice. And it was at Venice that, at least for European audiences, his story began. It was, in a sense, at Venice where the story of Japanese cinema in the West more or less started, because it was at the Venice Film Festival in 1951 that this film, Kurosawa Akira's Rashomon, made a huge splash, and it won the Golden Lion, the top prize. Now, Kurosawa, still, I suppose, Japan's most famous director of the classical period. In some ways, he was a very proud man, but in some ways, he was a rather modest man. And I think he might have admitted that actually Mizoguchi deserved to have been honored before him. After all, when Kurosawa gave the eulogy at Mizoguchi's funeral in 1956, he declared Mizoguchi was the Japanese cinema's truest creator. At the same time, we might remember that Japan's is a culture where seniority is very important. And Mizoguchi, born in 1898, was 12 years older than Kurosawa. And I think it's fair to say that he was a bit envious when Kurosawa scooped this sudden, extraordinary international distinction. And he vowed to match Kurosawa's achievement. He even threatened to retire from filmmaking if he didn't. And in one sense, in fact, he didn't, because he didn't scoop the Golden Lion. He didn't scoop the top prize at Venice for the film he submitted, Saikaku Ichidai Onna in Japanese, The Life of Oharu, it's usually called in English. But he did win a prize. He won the International Award at the 1952 Venice Film Festival. So he felt the honor was satisfied, and he went on making films. In fact, he never retired. Even when he was on his deathbed, he was scribbling notes on the last script that Yoda had written for him. And I think it can be argued that his last 4 years represent a kind of supreme artistic flowering, in a sense, because this Western adulation was a great advantage to him back at home. It gave him more clout to realize his films in the way he wanted. So that's why we've made these last years the focus of our program over the next few months here. Having said that, we shouldn't forget that he went back a long way. And in fact, when The Life of Oharu brought him to European attention in 1952, only a very few people remembered that he'd actually been discovered in the West once before. In the 1920s, when a film called Passion of a Woman Teacher, which from the surviving plot summary seems to have been a supernatural story, had been screened in Paris. A generation later, the film had disappeared like so many Japanese films from the 1920s, including almost everything Mizoguchi made at that period. So we can't look back to Mizoguchi's first film to win international distribution, but we can look back over his long career and acknowledge that his late masterpieces were the culmination. It's a career that had encompassed one of Japan's very earliest sound films. And those of you who already have some awareness of Mizoguchi's cinema might be a bit surprised to hear that this is actually a kind of musical. But at the same time, Japan is quite unusual in that sound and silent films coexisted for a few years. And in the early to mid 1930s, Mizoguchi was still making some remarkable silent films. After this, his career was to continue through the troubled 1930s, through the catastrophe of the Second World War, through the American occupation, and into the era of peace, prosperity, and economic growth in the early post-war years. So I'm going to start by leading us through Mizoguchi's career. I'll talk about how his work relates to Japan's society and politics in a tumultuous time. I'll talk about his representation of women and his engagement with classic Japanese literature. I will show lots of stills on the PowerPoint, and I'll show a couple of short clips. But what I think I can't do really is quite show to you the beauty of these films. The images in themselves are marvelous, but they don't quite show it because Mizoguchi's art is all about movement. It's about the way in which he choreographs his actors against their environment. It's about the way in which he moves his camera. And even when we see the clips, I'm not sure they quite illustrate Mizoguchi's full glory, because the power of his scenes is dependent on their full dramatic context. So you'll just have to come back over the next few months to the screenings and witness it for yourselves. So let's have a kind of potted voyage through Mizoguchi's career. Already in the 1930s, he is beginning to explore, well, firstly, one theme, which is going to be very important to him, which is the situation of women. And he's also achieved an expertise in literary adaptation. And sometimes those literary adaptations are actually based on foreign literature, which was, I suppose, a conventional enthusiasm for an intellectual of his generation, the generation born in the late Meiji period, the generation that was young in the liberal Taisho period. So in the mid 1930s, he is transposing to Japan the work of authors like the French Maupassant, like the Russian Tolstoy, whose late novel Resurrection, which is now, relatively obscure compared to War and Peace or Anna Karenina, was a kind of totemic work for Japanese liberals at that time. But Mizoguchi also frequently adapted Japanese authors. And here on the left there, you can see Izumi Kyoka, who was an author of kind of flamboyant melodrama. And it's in that mood that Mizoguchi directed two major adaptations, Cascading White Threads, Taki no Shiraito, and Orizuru Osen, the Downfall of Osen, it's usually called in English. And both of these films have the same story. In both, there is a man who is trying to achieve kind of professional fulfillment. So a law student on the one hand, a medical student on the other. And in both, his efforts are supported by a heroine who, as a result of that support, ends up grievously suffering. Now, this is a kind of conventional melodramatic plot formation of its time. But Mizoguchi's input is to focus with profound sympathy on the travails of these heroines, and in that, the drama is strengthened by the fact he had two great actresses, Irie Takako and Yamada Isuzu, both of whom give extraordinary performances. And the result really is to transform these narratives into a kind of social critique, which reflects quite profoundly on the expectation that a woman's role is to support male development or achievement. In some ways, those films still don't represent Mizoguchi's style at its height. By 1936, he had moved finally decisively into the sound era, and the two films you see here are often regarded as his first genuine masterpieces. They both take their names from famous cities in Japan. So Osaka Elegy, you'll see in Japanese, it's actually called Naniwa Elegy. That's ironic because Naniwa was the historic name, poetic name of Osaka. But this film is kind of bang up to date. And it focuses on the kind of slow decline of the heroine who's a switchboard operator. And it's paired with Sisters of Gion, Gion no Kyodai. Gion is the geisha district of Kyoto. And in both films, the defiant heroine is played again by Yamada Isuzu. And Mizoguchi does something quite unusual. Already he is perfecting a style in which he keeps the actors a long way from the camera, and in which the camera watches them from afar. In fact, it very much watches them in these films. These films don't have the kind of elaborate camera movements you'll see if you come back to watch the late films. But in both cases, he privileges his heroines with a kind of dramatic close-up where they actually get to deliver the moral of the film. So heroine of Osaka Elegy declares, well, I have a disease that can't be cured. It's a disease called delinquency. The heroine in Sisters of Gion cries out, there shouldn't be any such a thing as the geisha system. Now, some people might think perhaps it's inartistic to pronounce the moral so clearly, but Mizoguchi isn't so much telling us, this is what I want to say, as indicating that the heroines have learned that lesson. Moreover, being explicit in that sense was actually quite brave, because this was a time when progressive values were imperiled in Japan. The 1930s shows the gradual cementation of control by the militarist regime. And it becomes increasingly difficult for Japan's filmmakers to do anything other than conform to its values. And that is particularly the case from 1939, when the Japanese government explicitly regulates the film industry through a set of laws that are known as the film laws. And these laws demand that Japanese cinema will promote the values that the military regime wants to argue for. So we cannot any longer acknowledge the existence of social tension in modern Japan. We are expected instead to make films which will show people doing their duty, whether that's their duty as soldiers or as farmers or as industrial workers, or as women, wives, and mothers. Well, how did Mizoguchi respond? Well, I suppose it could be said he made a kind of tactical retreat. In 1939, he realized one of his most beautiful films, Zangiku Monogatari, Story of the Late Chrysanthemums, which is a story of the Kabuki theater. And it takes a step back into the late 19th century, into the Meiji era. By moving away from the present, Mizoguchi is able to carve out a kind of precarious freedom. So to a certain extent, this is a film which deals with a political difficulty by being apolitical. But at the same time, it's another story in which a male hero's progress is facilitated by and dovetailed with the sufferings of the woman who loves him. And again, it's possible to see, even here at this difficult time, a covert feminism. Well, by the early 1940s, even this kind of protest is difficult to sustain. Mizoguchi was now under contract to Shochiku, one of Japan's leading studios, and a studio which, as those of you who are familiar with the work of Yasujiro Ozu may know, was associated primarily with slice of life films, films about ordinary bourgeois life. This was a category that the film law had explicitly discovered, discouraged. Shochiku was briefly threatened with closure for not producing enough films that favored the war effort. And it was in that context that Mizoguchi kind of volunteered to direct a version of the old Warhorse, the story of the loyal 47 Ronin of the Genroku era, the Shushingura, so the Ronin who risk and eventually sacrifice their lives in order to avenge their dead lord. But although this is, in a sense, a film which is very much in conformity with the values of the time, Mizoguchi doesn't produce a rhetorical film. It's a film which is realized with a kind of delicacy and understatement that, to a certain extent, undercut its propaganda message. And now, Mizoguchi's own behavior at this time seems to have been rather equivocal. On the one hand, he was sent to Manchuria to assist with the development of the colonial film industry there. When he went, he was there as a kind of honorary army officer, and he wore a sword and insisted on being addressed as sir. But at the same time, it seems apparent that his heart was not in this set of circumstances, whereas he seems to have committed himself enthusiastically to the new and completely transformed situation after Japan's defeat. So for 7 years, from 1945, Japan fell under American occupation. This is still a time of censorship. the Japanese cinema is still required to conform to the dictates of the authorities. It's a different set of authorities, and they have completely transformed values. One thing that they are very skeptical about is Japan's past. It becomes almost impossible to make period films because samurai heroism is discouraged. Swordplay is not to be seen on screen. Fidelity to a master is not to be promoted. And so when Mizoguchi wanted to realize a portrait of the artist, an account of the great woodblock master Utamaro, he actually had to go in person to the headquarters of the American occupiers, and he had to argue. Utamaro was, in his 18th century context, a rebel. He was a liberal. He was a precursor of democratic values. And that argument won the day. This was one of only 4 period films that appeared in Japan in 1946. Mizoguchi's other films during the occupation are set in the present day, and they proffer a radical vision of women's rights, which I think is still surprising today. This was fully in conformity with the expectations of the occupying authorities, because women's rights was something that the Americans were very keen to promote. But Mizoguchi went really beyond those expectations. And I just want to highlight the film we see on the bottom right there, which I wish we could show in the season. We weren't able to acquire a copy we could screen. But here, Tanaka Kinyo plays brilliantly the wife of a Meiji-era liberal statesman, and she gradually discovers that the freedoms and the values of equality which he preaches in his political life don't apply to his conduct in his own house. And although I won't spoil it in case you do manage to see it, I would say the ending of this film is so startling, it still seems radical 75 years after this film was made. Now, in making these films, Mizoguchi, as I say, was participating in a post-war project. And it's easy to think about this as being imposed from the outside. Obviously, Japan was under American occupation, but it was also a project that was participated in by many Japanese intellectuals at the time. It was enshrined in a new constitution, which was promulgated in 1947, and which actually is still in force unchanged, the oldest constitution in the world to have endured without alteration. And that was, I suppose, the most visible legal fruit of this period of occupation, which continued until 1952. There's the signing of the Treaty of San Francisco 6 months earlier, which led to Japan regaining its independence. And it emerged into, well, a period which in some ways was one of definite stability and success. It was an age of economic growth. In 1947, as you see at the top left there, Japan was still regarded as an undeveloped or underdeveloped, I should say, country. By 1964, it was hosting the Olympics and seeing the first journeys on the technological marvel of the Shinkansen bullet train. So in less than 20 years, it moved from a state of post-war devastation and poverty to being one of the richest countries in the world. This era of dramatic economic growth was, I suppose, cemented by the election victory of a pro-business, pro-American party, the Liberal Democratic Party, which came to power in 1955, the year before Mizoguchi's death, and has governed Japan almost uninterrupted ever since. So in some respects, it was a very hopeful time. Material conditions were in a state of continuous improvement. Every year was better in that sense than the last. But Mizoguchi, as a sensitive artist, was concerned to question its pieties and to ask how fully the new values had been implemented in reality. And again, the way he approaches that above all is through a focus on the situation of women. The Constitution had explicitly guaranteed equality between the sexes. Women were guaranteed for the first time ever the freedom to choose a spouse. Well, Mizoguchi questions the extent to which those constitutional rights were enacted in the real lives of Japanese women. And in particular, he reflects on the situation of marginalized categories of women, geisha and prostitutes, in a sequence of films set in modern Japan. And his very last film, called Street of Shame in English, which sounds rather moralistic. Actually, Akasen Chitai is literally just red light district. But some reports tell us that this film was actually mentioned in the Japanese Diet in 1957 when it was discussing whether prostitution should be made illegal. Now, I'm going to illustrate this focus on the situation of women with one of the films you can see in this season, Gion Bayashi, Gion Festival Music. And let's have a short clip from this film. The wonderful Wakao Ayako in one of her earliest roles, an actress, by the way, still living in her 90s, and really incarnating the new assertive persona of post-war Japanese womanhood, but doing so in this context of marginalization, of entrapment within the geisha system. And in the very next scene, we see her young colleague acknowledge that she is going to be forced to marry a much older patron. The guarantees of freedom to choose a spouse, it seems, will go nothing for her here. And the liberal values to which post-war Japan professes allegiance will not save her. At the same time, Mizoguchi also made a sequence of films, again set in the present day, which focused on the experiences of bourgeois women. And the example we're able to show in this season is Musashino Fujin, another splendid vehicle for the great Tanaka Kinuyo. It's a story which is, in a sense, shadowed by the war which has passed, but also by the change which is to come. And that is a theme not only expressed in the characterization, but also in the visual transformation of the geographical setting. Musashino, as highlighted in the title, is or was in the early 1950s still a rural and suburban region, but the film understands that it is soon to be incorporated into the Tokyo conurbation. And that geographical transformation suggests Japan's wider progress into modernity, a progress which Mizoguchi perhaps ironizes. It's also a literary adaptation by Orka Shohei, who at least those of you who are cinephiles might know as the novelist who wrote the source novel for Ichikawa Kon's famous war film, Fires on the Plain. And I think that is a central string to Mizoguchi's late achievement, is his skill as an adapter of literary text. Of course, in one sense, that's the skill of his screenwriter. Yoda wrote some brilliantly original scripts, but he also adapted and transformed some of Japan's modern and classic fiction. And that process of transformation was furthered by Mizoguchi's stylistic approach. And while Orka obviously was writing around about this time, was alive when this film was made, Mizoguchi more frequently in these late years looked back to the literary classics of the Japanese past, some of which we're showing here. So Chikamatsu Monogatari, well, Chikamatsu Monzaemon, great Edo period playwright, sometimes referred to as the Shakespeare of Japan. He wrote plays for the Bunraku Puppet Theater and for the Kabuki Theater in the Edo period. And Chikamatsu Monogatari, I suppose it seems like it's aspiring to be a very faithful adaptation. I mean, after all, the author's name is in the title of the film. And if you watch it carefully, I think you'll see that some of the ways that the actors are kind of directed to move very much pay homage to the stylized movements of the dolls in Bunraku theater. But arguably, the moral center of this film is in looking back at a restrictive or repressive traditional culture from the standpoint of the new post-war liberal individualism. So even in being faithful, it is transformative. But if we're really looking for a kind of transformative response to classic literature, I think we might go back to the film which introduced Mizoguchi to international audiences, because The Life of Oharu is also an adaptation of one of the great Edo period authors, the author Ihara Saikaku. Saikaku was the great chronicler of what is called the ukiyo, the floating world, the secular life, the pleasures and pursuits of what was already 300 years ago the world's biggest city. And again, Mizoguchi put the author's name in the title of the film. So we call it The Life of Oharu, but it's literally the life of a woman by Saikaku Ichidai Onna. And what Mizoguchi does, despite that declaration of fidelity, is that he transforms the tone. Saikaku is a humorist and an ironist. Donald Keene said reading one of his books is kind of like watching characters through the wrong end of a telescope. And well, Mizoguchi himself is the master of the long shot. He loves to keep his characters at a distance. And yet, despite that, he brings us emotionally close to the heroine, played by Tanaka Kinuyo in one of her greatest performances. So while Saikaku is amused by, laughs at his heroine, Mizoguchi and Tanaka move us with her tragedy. Finally, let me comment on Sanshou Daiyu, which many of us think is Mizoguchi's greatest film. Again, a literary adaptation based on a story by Meiji and Taisho era author Mori Ogai, but that in turn was based on a perennial legend. And Mori was writing this work particularly in the liberal Taisho period, but he was himself something of a conservative, at least at that stage of his career. He'd been inspired by the act of fidelity of Admiral Nogi, who in 1912 feeling he had failed to discharge his duty to the emperor in the Russo-Japanese War, committed harakiri shortly after the emperor's death. This posthumous declaration of loyalty inspired Mori to produce a number of Confucian fables about proper authority and obedience. And Sanshou Dayu, in his telling, is one of those stories. However, Mizoguchi and Yoda transform it, and our last clip will show us how. But they're also anachronistic words. They could come straight out of the International Declaration of Human Rights or the American Constitution. No Heian era aristocrat, this film is set 1,000 years in the past, no Heian era aristocrat would have addressed his son like that. But at the same time, when this film opens with a statement that this film is set centuries ago, before mankind emerged from barbarism or before mankind awoke as human beings, well, I think we have to regard that, ironically, we have to remember that the world had lived through the most atrocious barbarism in very recent years. Mizoguchi, I think, is keen to look to the past for lessons for the present. And he's not alone in this. His also distinguished colleague Daie Yoshimura Kozaburo filmed the famous Heian period prose work, The Tale of Genji, in 1951. And in a total departure from the plot of the original book, the climax involves Genji discovering that his lover, Murasaki, is in love with another man and generously letting her go, thus, obviously upholding her post-war freedom to choose a spouse. So in that sense, again, deliberate anachronism. And I sometimes think when I reflect on films of this period in Japan, it's rather like the modern Anglo-American television. Sometimes it's set in the past, and the heroes have all the approved 21st century attitudes. But Mizoguchi, I think, is doing more than that. He is associating modern secular liberal values with long-established religious precepts, which were represented there by the Buddhist goddess of mercy, Kannon. And at a time when the world is kind of urging Japan to leave its past behind, Mizoguchi finds humane values in that past, and the liberal values of the present are foreshadowed in the best of Japanese traditions. Mizoguchi insists on their ongoing validity and relevance. And I think that too is the assumption behind Mizoguchi's style, which reflects the delicacy of Sumie ink paintings and the vitality of woodblock prints, as well as the unique potential of cinema. And it's the assumption behind his drama, which approaches human experience with both serenity and outrage, which combines an awareness of tragedy with a capacity for hope. And that, I think, all those things are what makes his work worth revisiting today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex, for this really fascinating talk, diving into Mizoguchi's work and the context in which his creativity was born. So I think we have the time for a few questions. Let me just get the opportunity to remind our audience online that they can send through questions via the Q&A function on Zoom or commenting on social media if they're watching there. And if you have a question here, we have a microphone, so please wait for it to get to you so that we here and everyone at home can hear you. Do we have any questions? Someone here? Yes, just wait a second. There's a microphone getting to you. Thank you very much.
So I've read somewhere that Kenji's Mizoguchi's sister was actually sold as a geisha, and that affected his cinema. So can you say anything about this?
Yeah, well, I think yeah, because she was in a situation where her earnings as a geisha were supporting the family, and therefore, was supporting his education, his progress. So I think that narrative of a man being supported by a woman at a terrible cost, that is something which, it have a personal background for Mizoguchi. And I mean, I think as a person, I think he has possibly he had a rather equivocal attitude to women. He had quite complicated personal relationships, in life, and I think a thing which I find a little disappointing, arguably, is that Tanaka Kinuyo wanted to direct films, and he didn't support her, and tried to prevent her from becoming a member of the Directors Guild of Japan. So I find that kind of slightly sad on a personal level, but I think in terms of the attitudes embodied by his films, they are kind of really, they have a sort of impeccable feminism. Well, never trust the artist, trust the tale in the end.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we have another question here in the front, second row. Yeah, yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the insightful talk. About sort of Mizoguchi, where did he get his inspiration from? Did he have any sort of mentors, or did he have a role model that he kind of learned from?
Well, I mean, he was starting to direct at a very, very early phase in Japanese cinema. He made his first film in 1922. And at that point, the industry was really only just taking shape. If he'd been 10 years younger, then he would have entered a studio and been an apprentice for several years with one of the established directors. So Yoshimura, who I mentioned there, he spent several years working on Shimazu Yasujiro's films and learning his craft. And I mean, that was the norm, and those apprenticeships got longer and longer and longer. And Mizoguchi himself, was mentor to a number of important directors of the next generation, like Masamura Yasuzo. But I think, in the early 20s, really, Japanese cinema was still quite an artisanal thing. So you didn't serve those long apprenticeships. Of course, he would have been watching films, and he was aware of what was happening in Japanese cinema and internationally. I mean, he was inspired by German Expressionism in his early days, although we can't see any more of the films that were produced with that influence. I think the thing that really made him celebrated, actually, is that he made a film just after the great Kanto earthquake of 1923, and the film is called In the Ruins. And he rushed out with his camera to take documentary footage of the kind of post-earthquake situation, and then that was woven into a fiction feature. So that really was what I think made people aware that he was a talented filmmaker.
Thank you. We also have a question from online. I think you answered the first part of it when you said, why do you think Mizoguchi decided to focus on women mostly? But was he the only director to do that at the time, or were there other directors who were also looking at the same issues?
Oh, well, yeah, there are hundreds, really. I mean, I think, although, apart from Tanaka Kinuyo, who did manage to sustain a kind of short directorial career, although there were no other female filmmakers at work in studio fiction film in the 1950s. There are a great range of actresses, and there were a huge number of directors whose primary focus is on female experience. Yoshimura, who I mentioned, is one of those, and he produced a sequence of four or five films through the 1950s that focus particularly on career women. So people working in Kyoto, the traditional capital of Japan, and in traditional professions. And he explores how those traditional professions, like being a designer of kimono, being a traditional sweet maker, actually open up a space for women to have kind of freedoms that they might not have had if they were, say, married to a salaryman. Then Toyoda Shiro is the other one I'll mention, just because he's credited with a famous line where he was actually asked, well, why are Japanese actresses, on average, so much subtler than Japanese actors? And he said, oh, well, Japanese women have to spend their whole lives acting.
Do you have any other questions here? Oh, yes, here at the front.
Yes, thank you for the phrase, the present through the past, because that is true. I mean, clearly some of Mizoguchi's films that were set in present day Japan are very, very fine films. But I think it is those films set in the past that are going to be remembered as his greatest ones, because not only could Mizoguchi capture the beauty of Japanese culture, the architecture, the painting, the sculpture, the theatre, but there's always something in the films, even if it's not entirely explicit in the script, which is placing that beauty in a context which is unfair. Not only unfair to women, but unfair in general.
Yep.
And how do you feel about that?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think the scene which often comes back to me when I kind of think of that sort of contrast between stylistic beauty and actual dramatic events, which can be quite atrocious, is the scene where Sancho the bailiff's son leaves the camp. And although he's obviously kind of unhappy about what's happening, this is this is a kind of labor camp staffed by slaves. He's obviously been unhappy up to that point, but the moment he leaves is when the minister visits and is greeted with this exquisite display of Japanese traditional dance. And it's as if he's kind of horrified by seeing beauty against this backdrop of cruelty. And I feel that's quite kind of polemical on Mizoguchi's part. He's saying that he wants beauty to be in the service of human decency and compassion. And I think that's also what's going on in Ugetsu, which we're not showing in this season, but where he makes pots for their sheer aesthetic appeal at the beginning of the film, and then by the end he's making pots for the good of the community that he lives in.
Thank you. I think we had another question here in the front. Yes, and yeah. Thank you very much.
I think the difference between Kurosawa and Mizoguchi's film, I watched all the films by Kurosawa and Mizoguchi. And when I watch Kurosawa's film, he's very good at describing men, and I enjoy, because I'm a woman, but I don't learn many things about women in Kurosawa's film. Mizoguchi's films, I have to be ready to appreciate what he's saying using these women. And I wish I could see a film like Mizoguchi in present Japanese films. And maybe you had an interview with Japanese directors. Have you ever heard of the some directors who are imitating, who's trying to be like Mizoguchi? Because I've heard lots of influence by Kurosawa.
I think actually, yeah, that's something which slightly perplexes me, is that Mizoguchi's influence in Japanese cinema has not been as widespread, I think, at least in the 21st century, the late 20th century, as the influence of Kurosawa and above all Ozu. And I think there are a lot of modern Japanese film directors, including Koreeda Hirokazu most famously, but also people like, say, Shinozaki Makoto, who are making domestic dramas where the camera tends to spend a lot of time mostly being still, looking at people sitting around tables. That influence seems very sustained. the influence of Mizoguchi's choreography, much less so. And I think also the influence of Mizoguchi's narrative mode, much less so. Now, I think there's probably a practical reason for that it's quite cheap to make a film like Ozu. And it's and to make the kind of films Mizoguchi did required the resources of a studio system. And I mean, I think, you know, when he was first seen internationally, European and American writers thought, well, Mizoguchi is a great art filmmaker, but of course he wasn't. You know, he was a great commercial filmmaker. He was a filmmaker operating, you know, within a studio system that was producing 500 films a year for much of the 1950s. And you know, that meant that there was money to support his you know, stylistic extravagance, if you like to say. And I think I do find, you know, elements of Mizoguchi's style in one or two modern directors, such as the other Kurosawa Kiyoshi, who mostly makes horror films, but not exclusively. And he has some rather kind of elegant, sinuous tracking shots, and he tends to keep his camera a long way from the actors. But apparently, you know, when he was a film student, he never talked about Mizoguchi. He endlessly talked about Ozu, even though his films don't really look like Ozu's films at all. So yeah, I think it's saddening in a sense that you know, there hasn't been a Mizoguchi tradition. But there we are. The films are there for the ages.
Yeah. Do you have any other questions here? Yeah. So just wait a second for the microphone to come to you. Thank you.
Talking about influences, if you can give some names of Western directors that you reckon that they are influenced from Mizoguchi, and especially we like a today director, 21st century Western director that you think that it's close to his visions and to his style.
I think, yeah, so going sort of forward in time, I mean, I think all the French New Wave critics loved Mizoguchi. The one who I think is kind of most visibly influenced by them is Jacques Rivette, although, you know, perhaps most obviously in some of his lesser films like La Religieuse, which, you know, really doesn't look like, you know, Mizoguchi in France, but, you know, perhaps it's slightly arid by comparison. I think you can see a Mizoguchi influence in, say, you know, in Tarkovsky. And then, you know, in modern times, I suppose it is someone like Bela Tarr who makes these kind of very elongated art movies. You know, I think there are echoes of Mizoguchi in his style. I think what links all those filmmakers together is that they really are art house filmmakers. You know, they really were working in a kind of non-commercial context, in a way that Mizoguchi wasn't. And I suppose that's also the case with his immediate successes in Japan, because having said he doesn't have that much influence in today's Japanese film, he did have a lot of influence on Japanese cinema of the 60s and 70s. And you know, I think you know, a new wave filmmaker like Yoshida Kiju has, you know, quite a lot in common with Mizoguchi. But again, you know, that's within an art house context. And I think the commercial system which allowed this kind of film to be made disappeared in Japan by about 1965, 1970. And, you know, and that's why he doesn't have as many obvious successors as, oh, I should say, you know, Shinoda Masahiro is the one who most of the Japanese New Wave filmmakers, he was the one who most explicitly professed a debt to Mizoguchi.
Thank you. And I think that's all we have time for today. So please join me in thanking Alexander Jacoby again for his marvelous talk. Thank you very much. And also thank you to our audience here in the hall and our audience online. And following the event, you're going to get a simple feedback form. So we will be very grateful if you can fill it in, because it helps us holding events like this and continuously improve them. Before we wrap up, just let me talk you through a few of the events that we have coming up at Japan House London, starting, of course, from our film season curated by Alexander Jacoby, focus on Mizoguchi Kenji, which starts on in February and goes on until June 2024 on Sunday afternoons and Wednesday evenings. And we start with Life of Oharu. Bookings open on the 5th of February, and on our website you can find all the dates and the titles of the season. We also have our Island Stories, Contemporary Lives by the Saru River exhibition. It opened on November 2023, and it's open until 21st of April. So please check out our website as well for some dedicated gallery tours. And in connection with the exhibition, we are expecting a few visitors from Bhutan. At the end of February, we are holding a series of events featuring talks, demonstrations, and tastings where guests can learn about ohau, a soup made by simmering meat or fish in a base of wild seasonal vegetables. And they will also have the opportunity to try the dish themselves. And yes, that's the end of today.